were sort of firestorms that sort of pop up, right? But what happens in 1915 is something different. It has a premeditated nature, and that's what distinguishes it from its 19th century precedents. I think we can see its origins in some of these events and ideas, but its premeditated nature becomes crucial. What do? Well, first, you label all Armenians a security threat, something that does not hold up to evidence today. Second, you deport those on the border with Russia first, because remember, Russia is the Ottoman Empire's enemy. So the idea is these folks on the border represent a threat to our national security, so you deport those guys first. Third, there's the eventual wholesale deportation of the empire's entire Armenian population from Istanbul to the easternmost regions of the Ottoman Empire. So all of a sudden, this thing that starts as, well, it's about security, becomes wholesale. And you start with these groups that you claim are a threat, and then you move into the interior, and then you take everybody. And that's what happens in 1915. Finally, the Ottoman government employs the help of its ally Germany in this. In fact, many of these marches, the death marches, many of these massacres happen under the watchful eye of German military men during this period. The quote I have here is from Winston Churchill. I guess he gets 2 billings in this lecture. He says this after the massacres. There is no reasonable doubt that this crime, meaning the 1915 genocide, was planned and executed for political reasons. And this becomes crucial in defining it as genocide, not just another set of massacres of folks kind of not getting along and killing one another sort of indiscriminately. Here's another map. It's a similar map to the one we just looked at, but I want you to see this map to understand how it was done, right? So again, these targets are sort of the places of where the massacres are most profound. These little bullets here. These are places where the Armenians resist. They did not go like lambs to the slaughter. The siege at Van is very famous. Musa Dagh is very famous, right? But here's Van. These resistances were really short-lived, and I think it speaks to how few resources these Armenians had at their disposal. They could not hold off these massacres, and in fact, all of them are abysmal failures. The resistances are all abysmal failures. But I want to talk about how it's done. Here we have Eastern Anatolia, of course, and it moves to the rest of the empire. That's what I was talking about. So here's where they're worried about, because here's the Russian Empire. Really, you don't see too many deportations here, but what you get is this is where the historic, where most Armenians live. What you get here is you get sort of like an amoeba, right? It just sort of starts spreading, and where it becomes unquestionable. This is not about security. Look over here, what's going on over here, right? It becomes about getting rid of a particular population. It really does move to the rest of the empire. And remember, this is all part of the Ottoman Empire at this time: Mesopotamia, Syria, Kurdistan. We talked a bit about this, but I think it's important to understand the method. If it's all about method and intentionality with genocide, well, how was this genocide perpetrated? First, you label the Armenians the internal foe. They're the ones who are going to make us lose the war. They're the threat from within. So we need to get rid of them. We need to cut them out like a cancer. First, you get rid of the intellectuals and the cultural elite, because there will be no leadership. Then you have a mass execution of the male population. Why men? Well, these are the men who could potentially take up arms. So it happened in 3 stages. First, the 20 to 45-year-olds were rounded up. Then the 15 to 20-year-olds were rounded up. And then the 45-year-olds to 60-year-olds were rounded up. I guess the 45-year-olds, they didn't have much fight in them. They figured they were last. But there's amazing stories of mothers dressing their sons up as girls, so they wouldn't be sort of taken when their time came, because it became very clear certain groups were disappearing with regularity, and that's where that map I showed you with the resistances happened. How did they know this was happening? Well, all of a sudden the men start disappearing in these sort of roundups, and word gets out that if you don't do something, everyone's going to go. But it starts happening in this systematic way. So you take the men out first. Then you do mass deportations of the women and children. First, you confiscate all of their goods for the war effort. So you go into these houses, you take all the food, you take all the provisions, and then you set these folks out on a march, and they say, you can't be here anymore, you must go. And so they take whatever's left on their back, their children, whatever they can carry, the old, the young, but the women and children without men are sent out on these marches. And these marches become essentially death marches because it's April in the desert. It gets hot. These deportations take months. There are no provisions, and in fact, when someone falls behind, they are left behind or purposefully shot or thrown into rivers. The stories are pretty amazing. The legal part of this. How was it done? People say, well, this was just unfortunate. It was wartime. The Ottoman government had to do something. Maybe they weren't safe in these villages. You had to move them out. Well, there are two laws that are passed, and they go through the Turkish courts. And one is the law of deportation, and the second one is the law of expropriation and confiscation. And these are two laws that essentially make the genocide legal. So they pass these laws that say you can deport all of this particular group of people, and then you can take and you can confiscate and expropriate all of their goods. So this is sort of what makes it legal. It gets systematized and then legalized. Yeah.
Why would they move them all towards the Russian border?
Well, if you'll see, they didn't move them towards the Russian border. They were moving them really south, and so they were sort of moving them. They were moving them really, essentially, they were moving them to nowhere. Really, these marches were marches to nowhere. You'll notice a lot of them ended at the sea. Well, when you got to the sea, if you were left, you were thrown into the sea, right? So the idea was you move them out of these interior and you sort of, it spreads this way, right? The sort of heroic stories that come out, the almost Schindler List kind of stories that comes out of this moment are usually of a transport ship, a French ship, it's in the harbor that picks up refugees and takes them through that story. You know, my grandmother was part of these deportations, and she got taken to France on one of these French ships. You know, so the idea was that you move them out to nowhere in particular. And those concentration camps along the border were not really meant to sustain anybody there. They were sort of holding stations. There was no food, there was no water, but you really just moved them as far away as you could from those villages.
Why is modern Armenia on the Russian border?
Well, it becomes part of the Soviet Union in the 1920s. There's a brief period of independence. That place that is now Armenia has nothing to do with what was historic Armenia. It was carved out after the war by the Allies. That's where the Allies sort of thought that the only real estate sort of left, if you will. So yeah, so it was part of, and the Armenia was a Soviet republic up until 1991. Good question. And, yes.
What was the legal precedent for allowing people to be confiscated by the country? I mean, like, were they set up as a premise?
What was the reason? Well, these two. The legal. There was no. These laws were unprecedented. These laws go through the Turkish courts in 1915. So there wasn't a precedent. You mean, did this happen to other groups?
I'm just wondering
How did they justify this? And mass. Well, they justified it as wartime expediency. That this is a war, so we can do these things in a state of emergency. And remember, these are not citizens. These guys are subjects, right? So they are subjects of an empire that is in a wartime emergency. And so these laws go through the courts as justifications for an emergency that they're having. Does that answer? No? Yeah.
When we talk about Jewish issues, we can talk about legal.
Now, you know, one of the reasons I don't have a lot of information about these laws, because these laws were written in Ottoman Turkish, which is a language that is not used today very much, and all the archives are closed. So there is no way to have access to what the law of deportation and the law of expropriation and confiscation, what the paper trail was. People just you can't find it. Those archives are closed. So it's sort of interesting that any way of sort of understanding why and how this emerged is shrouded in mystery. We know they existed because they were published, but we don't know how it worked through because those archives, you can't get to them. Turkey denies this ever happened. So there isn't a place. And from what I understand, many of these archives are in such disarray anyway. I have friends who work on